There's a form of power most people never recognize, not the obvious power of threats and force, not the crude dominance of violence or coercion, but something far more sophisticated, far more effective, far more permanent. The power that makes people submit without ever realizing they're submitting. The authority that commands obedience while feeling like freedom. The control that operates so invisibly that those controlled believe they're making their own choices. Francis Bacon mastered this. He rose to the highest levels of power not through force or intimidation, but through mechanisms of influence so subtle that people obeyed him while thinking they were acting independently. He understood something that crude dominators never learn, that the most powerful authority is the kind people don't resist because they don't recognize it as authority. That true control doesn't announce itself. It operates in the shadows of consciousness, shaping behavior without triggering defensive responses. This is not about being liked. This is not about charisma or charm, though those can be tools. This is about engineering compliance through psychological mechanisms that bypass conscious resistance. About creating conditions where submission becomes the path of least resistance, the obvious choice, the natural response, where people do what you want them to do and believe it was their idea. Let's start with the foundation of invisible authority. It begins with understanding that people don't resist what they don't perceive as control. Obvious authority triggers reactance. When someone knows you're trying to make them do something, their psychological defenses activate. They resist. They push back. They assert autonomy even when compliance would benefit them, because humans have deep instincts against being controlled. But when control is invisible, when influence operates below conscious awareness, these defenses never activate. People comply because the alternative doesn't occur to them, or because compliance feels like their own decision, or because the entire situation has been structured so that doing what you want is the easy, natural, obvious path, while resistance would require effort and justification they're not willing to provide. Bacon recognized this in the Elizabethan court. Those who issued direct orders, who openly commanded, who made their authority obvious, they faced constant resistance. Courtiers would comply minimally, look for ways around orders, resent being commanded. But those who shaped situations so that people chose to do what they wanted, who made obedience feel voluntary, they achieved far more compliance with far less resistance. The first mechanism of invisible authority is creating the illusion of choice. People need to believe they're autonomous, that they're making their own decisions, that they're not being controlled. You can use this. You give them choices, but you structure the choices so that all options lead where you want them to go. They feel like they chose freely. But you determined the outcome by controlling what choices were available. Think about how this works in practice. You want someone to do something. You don't tell them to do it. You present them with 2 or 3 options, all of which involve them doing what you want, but in slightly different ways. Would you prefer to do this today or tomorrow? Would you like to handle this yourself, or would you like help? The person feels like they're choosing. They are choosing. But the fundamental question of whether they'll do it at all has been bypassed. You've structured the choice architecture so that compliance is embedded in all options. This works because people focus on the choice they're being given, not the choices they're not being given. You're selecting between option A and option B, so you feel autonomous. You don't notice that option C declining entirely wasn't offered. And if it occurs to you, saying no now requires actively refusing, which feels more aggressive and requires justification. The default is compliance. Resistance requires effort. Bacon used this constantly in political negotiations. He would present options that all served his interests, but gave others the feeling of agency. They would deliberate, choose, feel like they were driving the process. But he'd structured the options so that any choice they made advanced his agenda. They weren't being forced. They were being guided. And guidance doesn't trigger the resistance that force does. Now let's talk about the power of framing. How you present something determines how people respond to it. The same request framed differently gets different reactions. And if you control the frame, you control the response without people realizing they're being controlled. You want someone to do something difficult or unpleasant. You don't present it as difficult or unpleasant. You frame it as an opportunity, as a challenge they're capable of meeting, as something that demonstrates their competence or character. Suddenly, they're not being asked to do something they don't want to do. They're being given a chance to prove something about themselves. The compliance is the same, but the frame makes it feel voluntary, even desirable. Bacon understood that most human behavior is driven by identity and self-image. People do things that align with how they see themselves. If you can frame an action as consistent with their identity, they'll do it without feeling controlled. Someone with your expertise would handle this easily. A person of your integrity would definitely. You're not commanding. You're stating what someone like them naturally does, and they comply to maintain consistency with their self-image. The framing extends to how you present the relationship between you. Are you commanding them? Then they resist. Are you asking for help? Then they feel valued. Are you expressing confidence in their capability? Then they feel respected. The actual power dynamic might be the same, but the frame determines whether they experience it as domination or collaboration. Here's where it gets more sophisticated. You want long-term authority over someone, not just compliance on one issue. You do this by becoming their frame for interpreting reality. When they encounter situations, they automatically think, what would he think about this? When they make decisions, they consider, what would he advise? When they evaluate options, they use your framework without conscious awareness. This is invisible authority at its most powerful. You're not there. You're not giving orders, but you're in their head. Your perspective has become their default lens for seeing the world. They're regulating their own behavior based on internalized versions of what you would want. They're controlling themselves on your behalf without recognizing that's what they're doing. Bacon achieved this through consistent demonstration of judgment that proved reliable. When people came to him with problems and his advice worked, when his analysis of situations proved accurate, when his predictions came true, they began to trust his framework. And once they trusted it, they internalized it. His way of seeing became their way of seeing. His values became their evaluation criteria. He'd colonized their decision-making process. This requires patience. You can't force someone to adopt your frame. You have to demonstrate its utility repeatedly over time until they naturally start using it. But once they do, once your perspective has become their default way of interpreting situations, you have authority over them that doesn't require your presence. They carry you with them. They ask themselves what you would think. They've submitted to your authority so completely they don't even recognize it as submission. Let's discuss the mechanism of strategic dependency. You want someone to submit to your authority, you make them dependent on you. Not obviously, not in ways that feel like dependence, but you position yourself as the source of things they need, information they require, resources they want, access they desire, skills they lack, and because they need these things from you, they comply with you. Not because you're forcing them, because compliance maintains access. The key is making the dependency feel voluntary. They chose to rely on you because you're helpful, competent, generous. They don't think of it as dependence. They think of it as a beneficial relationship. But structurally, you've made yourself necessary to them. And necessity creates compliance without requiring force. Bacon was masterful at this. He made himself the person people needed for navigating court politics, for understanding legal complexities, for accessing certain networks. People came to him because he was useful. And once they were coming to him, once they relied on his access and expertise, they were in a relationship of dependence they didn't consciously recognize as such. They just knew that maintaining good relations with Bacon was important, so they complied with his requests. They supported his positions. They became his instruments without ever being commanded. The strategic dependency extends to emotional needs. People need validation. They need to feel valued. They need approval and recognition. If you become a primary source of these emotional goods, if people depend on you for feeling good about themselves, you have enormous power over them. They'll comply to maintain your approval. They'll avoid actions that might disappoint you. They'll seek to please you, all voluntarily, all while believing they're just maintaining a valued relationship. This is darker than practical dependency because it's harder to recognize and harder to escape. People can identify when they're materially dependent and work to reduce that dependence. But emotional dependency feels like connection, like relationship, like mutual care. It doesn't trigger the same defensive awareness. So people remain in emotional dependence on you without recognizing it as a form of submission to your authority. Now we need to talk about the power of silence and absence. Most people trying to establish authority make themselves too present, too available, too responsive. This reduces their power because it makes them seem dependent on others' attention. It positions them as reactive rather than central. Bacon understood that strategic silence and absence create authority. When you're not immediately available, when you don't respond instantly, when you're sometimes absent from situations, people start wondering what you're thinking. They become uncertain about your position, and that uncertainty makes them seek your approval more actively. Your silence becomes something people try to fill. Your absence becomes something people notice. This works because humans are social creatures with deep needs for certainty in their relationships. When someone's response is predictable and immediate, you don't worry about it. But when someone's response is uncertain, when you don't know what they're thinking, anxiety kicks in, and that anxiety creates motivation to secure approval and clarity. People start trying harder to please you, to understand you, to get your attention and validation. The strategic use of silence means not explaining yourself constantly, not justifying your decisions, not defending your positions. When you explain and justify, you're positioning yourself as accountable to others' judgment. But when you simply decide and act without explanation, you're asserting authority. Your decisions don't require justification. They simply are. And others have to accept them or explicitly rebel, which most people won't do without serious cause. Bacon would often make decisions and implement them without explaining his reasoning. People would wonder why. They'd speculate. They'd try to understand his logic. And in trying to understand, they'd often convince themselves that he must have good reasons they weren't seeing. His silence didn't create resistance. It created mystique. And mystique is a form of authority because it makes people assume you know more than you're saying. Let's examine the mechanism of graduated compliance. You want someone to do something big, something that might trigger resistance if asked directly. You don't ask for the big thing. You ask for small things first, things so small that refusing seems petty, things that don't feel like submission. And once someone has complied with small requests, they're psychologically primed to comply with larger ones. This works because humans have consistency bias. Once we've done something, we tend to do similar things to maintain consistency with our previous actions. If I've helped you with small tasks, refusing a larger task creates cognitive dissonance. I'd have to explain why I was willing to help before, but not now. Most people avoid that discomfort by continuing to comply. Bacon would use this in building alliances and obligations. Small favors asked and granted, small collaborations that went well, small gestures of support that cost little, and each small compliance made the next request easier. Each small yes made a large no harder. He'd gradually escalate what he asked for as people became habituated to saying yes to him. By the time he asked for significant things, compliance had become the pattern. Resistance would require breaking that pattern, which feels wrong even when it would be justified. The graduated compliance also works because early compliance creates investment. Once you've done several small things for someone, you've invested time and effort. Refusing later requests means that investment was wasted, so you continue complying to justify your previous compliance. You're trapped by sunk costs into continued submission. Here's something crucial that Bacon understood. Authority is largely performed and perceived rather than real. If people perceive you as having authority, you have it, regardless of your formal position, regardless of your actual power. The perception creates the reality because people respond to perceived authority with compliance. So you don't need actual authority to have authority. You need to be perceived as having it. And you create that perception through signals that people associate with authority. The way you speak, the way you carry yourself, the way you make decisions, the way you respond to challenges. If you perform authority convincingly, people will treat you as an authority, and their treatment of you as an authority makes you one. This means authority is circular and self-reinforcing. When people treat you with deference, others see that and assume you must have authority worth deferring to, so they defer as well. Your authority grows through social proof. People submit because they see others submitting, and each submission reinforces the perception that you're someone who should be submitted to. Bacon performed authority through controlled demeanor, through measured speech, through calm in crisis, through confidence in his judgments, through willingness to make decisions others hesitated over. He didn't announce his authority, he embodied it, and people responded to that embodiment by granting him the authority he was performing. The performance became reality through others' acceptance of it. The performance requires consistency. You can't be authoritative sometimes and unsure other times. You can't be decisive in some contexts and dithering in others. Authority requires maintaining the performance across situations. This is exhausting, but it's necessary. Because any break in the performance, any moment where you seem uncertain or weak or in need of others' approval, damages the authority you've built. Now, let's talk about the mechanism of making your priorities their priorities. You want people to submit to your authority? You make them care about what you care about. You align their goals with your goals. You make your success their success. Once they're invested in outcomes you control, they'll submit to your direction because your direction serves ends they now care about. This is manipulation at a sophisticated level. You're not forcing them to care. You're creating situations where caring serves them, where your success benefits them, where advancing your agenda advances theirs. You've engineered alignment of interests, and once interests align, compliance becomes voluntary. They're not submitting to you, they're pursuing their own goals. It just happens that pursuing their goals requires doing what you want. Bacon did this through patronage and partnership. He'd make people stakeholders in his projects. He'd ensure that his political successes created opportunities for his allies. He'd structure things so that his advancement pulled others up with him. Once people recognized that their fortunes were tied to his, they became invested in his success. And that investment meant they'd comply with his direction because his direction led to outcomes they desired. The alignment of interests is most powerful when people don't fully recognize it's been engineered. If they think they naturally share your goals, if they believe their investment in your success arose organically, they don't see their compliance as submission. They see it as collaboration toward shared ends. Meanwhile, you've structured the entire relationship so that the shared ends are actually your ends that they've adopted. Let's examine the power of information asymmetry. When you know things others don't know, when you understand situations others don't understand, you have authority based on knowledge advantage. People submit to your judgment because your judgment is based on information they lack. You're not forcing compliance. You're providing guidance that they accept because they recognize their own ignorance. Bacon was obsessive about information. He cultivated sources. He paid attention to details others missed. He analyzed patterns others didn't see. This information advantage gave him authority in discussions and decisions. People would defer to his assessment because he clearly knew more than they did. His superior information created natural authority that didn't require assertion. The key is not sharing all your information. If you explain everything you know, you eliminate the information asymmetry that creates your authority. You want people to know that you know more than them, but you don't want to tell them everything you know. You share enough to demonstrate your knowledge advantage, but not so much that they no longer need you. You make yourself indispensable through information they can't easily access without you. This creates dependency without coercion. They need your information to make good decisions. So they come to you, they ask your opinion, they defer to your judgment, all voluntarily, all because you've positioned yourself as the person who knows what they need to know. Your authority comes from knowledge advantage, and you maintain that advantage by carefully managing what you share. Here's where invisible authority becomes truly dark. The most powerful form is making people want to submit, not comply reluctantly, not follow because they have to, but genuinely desire to be under your authority because it feels good, because it meets psychological needs, because submission to you provides things they deeply want. Some people have psychological needs for structure, for direction, for being told what to do. Acknowledging this makes many uncomfortable, but it's true. Many people feel relief when someone else takes responsibility for decisions, when someone else provides clear direction, when someone else carries the cognitive and emotional burden of leadership. For these people, your authority isn't oppressive, it's service. You're providing something they want, and they submit eagerly. Bacon recognized this in some of his subordinates and allies. They didn't want to lead, didn't want to decide, didn't want the burden of responsibility. They wanted to follow competent leadership, so he provided it. He made decisions, he gave clear direction, he took responsibility, and they were grateful. They submitted completely because his authority met their needs. They experienced his control not as domination, but as care. This is invisible authority at its peak. When people want to submit to you, when your authority feels like gift rather than imposition, when compliance feels like relief rather than constraint, you're not forcing anything. You're providing structure that they're seeking, and they love you for it. The most dangerous form of power is the kind people thank you for exercising over them. The cultivation of this requires understanding what people need, what burdens they want lifted, what decisions they want made for them, what direction they're seeking. You don't impose authority on unwilling subjects. You provide authority to people who desire it. And in providing what they desire, you gain control that they defend rather than resist. Now we need to talk about the mechanism of social proof and consensus. People look to others to determine correct behavior. If everyone around them is deferring to you, they'll defer as well, not because you've commanded them, but because social proof makes your authority seem natural and legitimate. They're not submitting to you individually. They're conforming to group norms, and those norms happen to involve submission to you. This is why building authority with key influencers matters more than building it with everyone. If high-status individuals defer to you, others will follow their lead. If respected members of a community submit to your judgment, the community follows. You don't need everyone to recognize your authority directly. You need the right people to recognize it. Then social proof does the rest. Bacon built relationships with influential courtiers and officials. Once those relationships established his authority with key players, others followed. They saw important people treating Bacon with deference and assumed he merited that deference. His authority became self-evident through social proof. No one questioned it because everyone seemed to accept it. The social proof mechanism means that authority, once established, maintains itself. Each person who defers to you makes the next person more likely to defer. Each submission reinforces the social proof that you're someone who should be submitted to. Your authority becomes consensus reality, and consensus reality is extremely hard to challenge because challenging it means standing alone against group norms. Let's discuss the final mechanism. The most sophisticated, the most invisible, making submission feel like elevation. When people submit to your authority, they're not losing status. They're gaining it by association with you. They're not being diminished. They're being included in something greater than themselves. Their submission elevates them. This is masterful because it removes the primary psychological barrier to submission. People resist authority because submission feels like status loss, like diminishment. like becoming lesser. But if you structure things so that submitting to you actually increases their status, so that being under your authority is prestigious, then they'll seek that submission. They'll compete for the opportunity to defer to you. Bacon achieved this by making his circle exclusive and valued. Being close to Bacon, being trusted by Bacon, being part of Bacon's network, these became markers of status. So people sought to be in that circle, and being in that circle required accepting his authority. But that acceptance didn't feel like submission. It felt like achievement, like being selected, like elevation. When you make people feel elevated by submitting to you, when being under your authority is something they're proud of rather than ashamed of, you've created invisible authority at its most powerful. They're not being controlled. They're being included. They're not submitting. They're ascending. And they'll do extraordinary things to maintain that position. The cultivation of this requires building genuine value in association with you. You have to offer something people actually want. Status, access, knowledge, opportunity. You have to make being close to you actually beneficial. Then, once people want to be close to you, you can set the terms. And those terms include accepting your authority. But by the time they realize they've submitted, they're so invested in the relationship that submission feels worth it. So here's what Francis Bacon's system of invisible authority actually looks like in practice. You're not commanding anyone. You're creating choice architectures that make compliance the obvious option. You're framing requests so they align with people's identities and values. You're making yourself necessary through strategic dependencies. You're using silence and absence to create mystique. You're building graduated compliance through small requests that prepare for larger ones. You're performing authority until others grant it to you. You're aligning your interests with theirs so compliance serves them. You're maintaining information advantages. You're meeting their psychological needs for direction. You're using social proof to make your authority seem natural. And you're making submission feel like elevation. None of this looks like control. It looks like leadership, like collaboration, like relationship. People don't feel dominated. They feel guided, included, valued, elevated. And because they don't feel dominated, they don't resist. They comply willingly, eagerly, gratefully. They've submitted to your authority so completely they don't recognize it as submission. That's invisible authority, that's power without force, that's making people do what you want while believing it was their idea. That's commanding obedience without ever giving an order. It's the most sophisticated form of control, the most effective, the most sustainable, and the most dangerous, because people can't resist what they don't recognize as control. Francis Bacon mastered this 400 years ago. The mechanisms he used work just as effectively today. The psychology hasn't changed. People still resist obvious authority and submit to invisible authority. They still need to feel autonomous while actually being guided. They still respond to framing, dependency, social proof, and inclusion. The tools might be different. The principles are eternal. The question is whether you'll use them, whether you'll develop the sophistication to command without commanding, to control without forcing, to make people submit while feeling free. This is not for everyone. It requires patience, subtlety, and willingness to operate in the shadows of consciousness where true power resides. But for those who master it, for those who learn to wield invisible authority, the rewards are extraordinary. Authority that doesn't create resentment, compliance that doesn't require enforcement, power that sustains itself through the voluntary submission of people who don't even realize they've submitted. That's what Francis Bacon achieved. That's what's available to those who understand that the most dangerous form of power is the kind people don't know they're under.